An Italian Baroque violinist composer who was the rock star of his day, who is said to have thrown himself out of an upper story window, or was thrown out by a jealous competitor, depending on which version you believe, was said to be extremely arrogant and eccentric, even mad, who turned down court positions in order to travel, getting into fights and scrapes all over the place, moving from Florence to Dresden to London. He also survived shipwreck in the English Channel. But also one of the best violinists of his day. Buckle up for a wild ride as we investigate the life of Veracini. Veracini was one of the great violinists of the early 18th century in Italy. He played so well that he intimidated even virtuoso Giuseppe Tartini. Notoriously arrogant, perhaps borderline insane, Veracini was nevertheless famed throughout Europe for his performances as well as his compositions. Although he was an instrumentalist, about half of his output was vocal. And for a while he was Handel's great rival as an opera composer in London. Veracini spent his youth in his native Florence, but established himself in Venice in 1711. There he played in various church orchestras, and in 1712 a performance of his so impressed Tartini that the latter withdrew for a while to study better use of the bow. During this time, Pietro Locatelli, another great violinist to be, most likely studied with Veracini. In 1714, Veracini performed in London. He spent the following year in Germany, and after further travels obtained a court position in Dresden in 1717 at an impressive salary. In August 1722, though, he found himself hurtling to the ground from a third-floor window. Whether this was a suicide attempt or a bungled murder remains unclear, for Veracini was not entirely lucid on the subject. He survived, but rumours of madness followed him on his subsequent journeys, including a period back in Italy, working as a violinist and composing oratorios and sacred works. Veracini returned to London in 1733, where he became a ubiquitous figure, performing everywhere, and having his operas produced at the Opera of the Nobility, the chief rival of Handel's theatre. Except for a brief period back in Italy, Veracini remained in London for years. Charles Burney wrote approvingly that the peculiarities of his performance were his bow hand, his vibrato, his learned arpeggios, and a tone so loud and clear that it could be distinctly heard through the most numerous band of a church or theatre. Veracini returned to Italy for good by 1750, working primarily as a church musician in Florence, mainly composing and conducting, but also occasionally playing the violin into his 70s. As a composer, Veracini came to write concertos strongly influenced by Vivaldi's. His sonatas in some ways resembled Corelli's, but often without the fugal elements, except for those written for fugue, mad, Dresden, and in some ways point the way to Tartini's. Later, though, the progressive turned conservative and became more interested in canonic writing. Similarly, the arias of his London operas show the influence of Handel, a composer he would later denounce. After years of travel, when he wound up back in his native Florence, he had by that time suffered from a bad reputation, and according to Charles Burney, was usually qualified with the title of capopazzo, head lunatic. Let's look at some details of his life. First, let's start with his relatives, because there were a number of violinists in his family. His grandfather, Francesco di Niccolo Veracini, had been one of the first violinists of Florence and ran a music school in his house until ill health forced him to turn the business over to his eldest son Antonio in 1708. And that brings us on to his uncle Antonio Veracini. Antonio had learned to play the violin from his father Francesco. Uncle Antonio was also born in Florence. He took over the running of the school from his father, where he taught the violin to, amongst others, his nephew, Francesco Maria Veracini, later a celebrated violinist and composer in his own right. But unlike his nephew, he was well rooted in Florence and rarely left the city. It is suggested, though, that he may have visited Rome and Vienna and may have met Arcangelo Corelli. He died at quite an old age for the time, in 1733, aged 74, and there are some surviving compositions by Uncle Antonio Veracini. Now on to Francesco. He was born on the 1st of February 1690 and lived until the 31st of October 1768. So also lived quite long for the time. He was an Italian composer and violinist, perhaps best known for his sets of violin sonatas. His place of birth was the family house on the Via Palazzuolo, parish of San Salvatore Ognissanti, Florence. He was the second and only surviving son of Agostino Veracini. His father was actually a pharmacist and an undertaker, and one of the few Veracinis who was not a violinist, not even an amateur. So it was more his uncle and grandfather who influenced the young Francesco. And so even though his father was not a musician as such, Francesco was born into a family of musicians and artists. His grandfather and Antonio were major violinists in the city of Florence. Other instructors in the city included the organist at Florence Cathedral. Francesco often appeared in concert with his uncle Antonio Veracini and was also taught by Giovanni Maria Cassini and his assistant Francesco Ferrocci. As well as being musical, the family managed a painting studio and possessed a large collection of artworks, including 4 Ghirlandaio's, a Rubens, a Carracci, and a dozen other paintings by the 3 members of the family from 2 generations, including grandfather Francesco's 3rd son, Benedetto. The painter Niccolo Agostino Veracini was Francesco Maria Veracini's cousin. Around Easter 1711, Francesco Veracini decided to leave Florence. Francesco Maria Veracini esteemed Carlo Ambrogio Lonati as a great violinist. Veracini is known to have been a soloist in Venice at the Christmas Masses at San Marco on 24th and 25th December 1711. This took place in the St. Mark's Basilica in Venice. But Veracini was never a regular member of the chapel's orchestra. On the 1st of February 1712, he performed a violin concerto of his own composition, the first recorded public performance by Veracini playing one of his own compositions, accompanied by trumpets, oboes and strings, as part of the celebrations in honour of the Austrian ambassador to Venice of the newly elected Holy Roman Emperor Charles VI. The celebration, held in Santa Maria Gloriosa del Frari, included a vocal Te Deum and Mass, as well as motets and concertos performed under the direction of Padre Fernando Antonio Lazzari. The manuscript scores of the works performed that day, including Veracini's concerto, were bound together in a handsome presentation volume now found in the National Library of Austria. This concerto may have been Veracini's Violin Concerto in D major, 1711, also performed in Frankfurt as well as Venice. At Charles VI's coronation on the 22nd of December 1711, just 2 days before Veracini's appearance as a soloist on Christmas Eve in Venice, some 800 kilometres to the south. So already at this time the composer is travelling between Germany and Italy. First trip to London. In 1714, Veracini went to London and played instrumental pieces, or symphonies as we would call them today, between the acts of operas at the Queen's Theatre. At the court of Johann Wilhelm, Elector Palatine, and Anna Maria Luisa de' Medici, he performed his oratorio Mose al Mar Rosso. While in London in 1714, Veracini also appeared in a series of benefit concerts. On to Venice. In the summer of 1716, Veracini arrived back in Venice, where he dedicated a set of 12 solo sonatas to the Prince of Saxony in Germany. In that same year, 1716, he was appointed as the head of a Venetian music school. There is a legend that when Giuseppe Tartini heard Veracini playing the violin, he was so impressed by his bowing technique and so dissatisfied with his own skill that he retreated the next day to Ancona in order to study the use of the bow in more tranquility, with more convenience than at Venice, as he had a place assigned him in the opera orchestra of that city. I think it's fair to say that Veracini therefore had an impressive bow arm. Next, he moved on to Dresden, and this is where the drama began. Veracini wrote a set of violin recorder sonatas dedicated to Prince Friedrich August, who came to celebrate Carnival. This German Prince of Saxony, although he knew that a violinist was not needed at this time at the Dresden court, nevertheless persuaded his father to hire Veracini, who travelled to Dresden in 1717. He transferred from the prince's private employment to the regular court payroll at a high salary and remained in Dresden until 1722. Apparently at the same time, the prince hired an entire opera company under the direction of Italian composer Antonio Lotti. So this prince was certainly a music lover and willing to pay well for the services of the likes of Francesco Maria Veracini, who was very well remunerated. But to justify his salary, Veracini did have to compose chamber music for the court, and so he officially became Kapellmeister in August 1717 rather than just violinist. And in 1719 he recruited more Italian singers for the new Dresden opera Amtsvinger. Back in Venice, he secured the services of Margherita Durastanti and Vittorio Tesi, and then moved on to Bologna to add Maria Antonia Laurenti to take all these back to Dresden to work for the prince. Veracini also took the opportunity to visit his hometown whilst on this trip back to Italy, where he married Chiara Tesi. In 1721, Veracini wrote another set of violin sonatas dedicated to the prince, published in Dresden as his Opus 1. Unfortunately, at this time there was animosity among all the gifted musicians gathered at the court in Dresden. In 1722, the arrogant Veracini was involved in a quarrel, staged according to one source by the composer and violinist Pisendel, which resulted in Veracini leaping out of an upper story window and breaking his foot in 2 places and also his hip. Quite a horrific injury, in fact, that left him limping for the rest of his life. It was said that he leaped out the window in a fit of madness brought on by applying himself too much to music and by studying alchemy. A musical treatise that Veracini wrote hints, however, that there was a plot against his life inspired by jealousy, so perhaps someone pushed or threw him out the window. I guess we'll never know for sure what actually really truly happened there. But certainly there was some drama during this time in Dresden. There's also an account of the humiliation of Veracini at the hands of the last desk violinist in the orchestra, who was asked to replace Veracini in playing a concerto. Maybe some animosity and resentment had arisen from that. Pisendel had been rehearsing his composition intensively with this violinist, and Veracini fell into such a rage that he did not come out of his room for several days. He hadn't received the solo he expected to get, and out of shame and despair publicly threw himself out of a window onto the street in Dresden. So that's one account. Did he jump out the window, or was he pushed? Or here's another account, that the jealous German musicians plotted to murder him, and so he himself jumped out of the window to escape the murderers. So his time in Dresden between 1717 and 1722 was particularly tumultuous, and concluded with him falling out of the sky. Veracini left the city after this and went back to his native Florence in 1723. Apparently the Dresden musicians, fearing for their position, were relieved that he had left. Back in Florence, he played music in a church, and during this time suffered from his bad reputation and received the title Capopazzo. Nevertheless, he composed a Te Deum for the coronation of Pope Clement XII in 1730. Francesco's uncle Antonio died in 1733, leaving the bulk of his estate to Francesco Maria. Among other things, this included no fewer than 8 violins made by Jakob Steiner and 3 Amatis. The documents from this time, 1723 to 33, most often show him as a composer and performer of religious music, principally of oratorios produced by lay religious companies. But he did also compose a Mass and a Te Deum in celebration of the election of the Pope, the Florentine Pope. Veracini's violins. It is possible that Veracini may have owned a Marcus Steiner, who may have been the brother of Jakob Steiner, as well as the aforementioned violins he inherited. Back to London. In 1733, Veracini arrived back in London and appeared in many concerts. In 1735, he composed an opera for the Opera of the Nobility, Adriano in Syria. Apparently, George Frederick Handel was present at the premiere in Haymarket Theatre, as were members of the British aristocracy. Apparently, the score has survived and is in the Newman Flower Collection Library or the Henry Watson Music Library of the Manchester Central Library. In 1736, Veracini wrote some arias for the Pasticcio Orfeo by Nicola Porpora. And in 1737 he wrote La Clemenza di Tito on a libretto by Angelo Maria Cori, based on Metastasio. In 1738, Veracini wrote his third opera, Partenio, and then returned to Florence, where he stayed until 1741, then came back to London and composed his last opera, Rosalinda, based on Shakespeare's play As You Like It. An unusual choice of material at the time. In that opera, Veracini included the well-known Scots ballad tune The Lass of Patty's Mill. It was staged in London in 1744. The same year, his oratorio L'Errore di Salomone was staged. Charles Burney was not impressed and scorned the music of Rosalinda as wild, awkward and unpleasant, manifestly produced by a man unaccustomed to write for the voice and one possessed of a capopazzo. A little over a year later, Veracini left London again. In 1745, or shortly after, he survived a shipwreck in the English Channel in which he lost 2 of his Steiner violins, the ones he called St. Peter and St. Paul, thought to have been the best in the world, and all of his effects. He was about 55 at the time and lost everything he had, which included 3 violins considered the best in the world, and I suppose the fame of Stradivari and Guarneri violins was still rising at that time. Back to Florence. Veracini returned to Florence, where he was appointed Maestro di Cappella in the churches of San Pancrazio and San Gaetano, the latter one at which his uncle had worked, focusing on church music. Though he mostly conducted in his later years, he still sometimes appeared as a violinist. Veracini spent most of his last 2 decades in Florence, where increasingly he devoted his time to composition. It was during this time that he finished his second and only surviving treatise on music, which contains an odd mix of harmony, counterpoint, career advice and moralizing. Veracini died in Florence. He was 78 years old when he died. Apparently he was still conducting and playing violin into old age. In addition to his violin sonatas, which were later edited by Ferdinand David, his operas and his oratorios, Veracini also wrote violin concertos, sonatas for recorder and basso continuo, and orchestral suites called overtures. The 6 overtures were performed for Prince Friedrich August in Venice in 1716, as part of his ultimately successful attempt to secure a position at the Dresden court. They're all either in F major or B flat major, except for one in G minor. The last of these in B flat major is remarkable for concluding with a unison minuet. Veracini formed a style of playing unique to himself, and the same could be said of his compositional style. Although his works show a familiarity with the musical characteristics of his contemporaries, he actually followed his own path, becoming increasingly interested in applying the musical techniques of fugue, canon, inversion, and imitation. Eventually, Veracini moved away from the homophonic style he once cultivated, equating it with ignorance and laziness. Homophony is a single dominating melody, accompanied by chords, as opposed to more than one melodic line as in polyphonic music. He wound up composing a lot of his work in order to showcase his own ability on the violin. He thought that the existing pieces for violin just weren't difficult enough for him. In conclusion, as a composer, according to Manfred Bukowza, his individual, if not subjective, style has no precedent in Baroque music and clearly heralds the end of the entire era. While Luigi Torchi maintained that he rescued the imperiled music of the 18th century. His contemporary Charles Burney held that he had certainly a great share of whim and caprice, but he built his freaks on a good foundation, being an excellent contrapuntist. Fun fact, the asteroid 10875 Veracini was named after Francesco Maria Veracini. In his usual independent manner, Veracini deliberately pursued an eccentric musical course throughout his life. He was generally considered one of the finest violinists in Europe, as well as one of the most arrogant. Stories of both his ego and eccentricities were in common circulation. Born and raised in Florence, he spent considerable time in many other musical centres, including Venice, Dresden, and London. His music is airy and tight, and difficult to play. In the words of Heather Tasko, the guy may have been mad, but he had lovely music inside him.